The arrow sang before anyone saw it. A thin, hissed note, fast and mean, slicing through the bright chatter of the dawn feast. Trays clinked. Laughter broke like glass. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, a blindfolded servant stepped forward and cut that sound in half. Sable didn't look. She couldn't, not with linen tied neat across her eyes. She listened. Left to right, high to low, the pitch telling her where steel would be in one more breath. Her cane came up on instinct. Oak met arrow with a crack that shook her bones. The shaft split, skidded, spun hissing past her shoulder, and died in the banner behind the Alpha King. Silence rushed in. Wolves lifted their heads. Every watcher in the great hall remembered their hands, their throats, their fear. Sable planted the cane again, knuckles white, the sting of impact singing up her arms. She kept her chin at the angle that invites pity and deflects questions. Linen lay smooth over her eyes. Dale ink cooled under her skin, a prickle at the wrists where she'd painted protection. She said nothing. She breathed in smoke and sweet fruit and the sharp cold of metal that wanted more work. On the dais, Alpha King Yarrick didn't move like prey. He moved like weather that had decided to hold. Broad shoulders. Quiet hands. Eyes that could warm or cut, and right now did neither. He looked at the broken arrow, at the split in the banner shaped like a mouth that had changed its mind, then at the blindfolded girl who had put herself between death and his throat. Across from him, Chancellor Hale smiled the way men smile when they find a new lever. It never touched his eyes. He spoke softly, a little too casual. Well. That's fortunate. Around the room, nobles remembered how to pretend. Laughter, thin and late. Goblets raised with hands that shook a little. Music trying to find the note it had lost. Sable didn't move. The cane head pressed into the flagstones, the sound of it telling her where the hall's weight sat. She mapped the room by noise, cloth brushing thigh, a ring against glass, the faint whistle of a guard's breath through a crooked nose. And under it, always, the low hum she'd felt the first time she crossed this floor. Not pipes. Not wind. Something older. The keep's lattice, the net of vows sunk deep into stone, murmuring to itself like a hive that refuses to sleep. Hale's voice slid on. Your Majesty, shall we keep the peace? He gestured, and a priest in white stepped from the shadows with a silver ampulla and a tidy bundle of salt. A blessing. Of course. Sable's wrists prickled hard. Dale ink rose like small bees under her skin. She lowered her head as if in reverence and set a hum low in her chest, the note she used when she needed oil to change its mind. The priest came gentle, palms out, voice soft enough to pass as kindness. For truth, he murmured. For safety. The first drop beaded above her pulse. Met the invisible ridge she had painted there before dawn. Hesitated. Slid away. Salt dusted her skin, then lifted as if the air itself had decided to carry it elsewhere. A few nobles leaned forward. One laughed once and swallowed it whole. Hale's smile tightened, then smoothed again, practiced and pleasant. Yarrick said nothing. He didn't stop the priest. He didn't signal the guard. He watched. Not the way a man looks for guilt. The way a wolf listens for weather. Sable kept her hum steady, the sound more bone than voice. The ink cooled. The oil lost interest. The priest stepped back with a professional nod that hid his frown. Grateful, Hale said, almost warm. Now that we are secure. The music tried again. Harp. Flute. A polite air about loyalty, the kind people hum when they need to convince themselves that duty is a sweet thing. The hall arranged itself around comfort and carried on with the performance of safety. Servants poured wine. Sable did her work with hands that remembered their own rules, move like water, speak only when silence would do harm, leave every room with a door open in your mind. She was almost clear of the dais when she heard it. Wrong sweetness. Wine with a bright, bitter edge. A goblet that sang a half note too sharp when it touched the tray. She didn't think. She let the cane catch the tray's rim with a sharp lift. Red spilled before Jarek's hand could rise. It ran across white linen like truth that didn't care who saw. A gasp rolled through the hall and broke. Hale's eyebrows climbed, surprised and not. The priest's mouth opened and shut. Jarek's eyes met the dark stain, then Sable's covered face. His voice came quiet, even, carrying without force. Enough. The room obeyed. It always did when he used that tone. The music fell away. The priest's hands stilled at his sides. Hale's smile held, thinner now, mind clicking through new routes. Sable stood with the empty flagon, the cane, the weight of 100 stairs. Under the floor, the hum pressed harder, hungry and patient, the lattice wanting what it always wanted, agreement, signatures, throats. She swallowed against the taste of iron on her tongue and kept her shoulders easy. A steward hurried to wipe the spill. Guards found better places to put their eyes. Hale broke the silence with the softest edge. Clumsy hands. Unfortunate. He sounded like a man asking a question without words. How did a blind girl catch an arrow and taste a poison she shouldn't have known was there? Jarek lifted his own jug, poured from it into a clean cup, and drank. Calm. Deliberate. The hall watched his throat work, then watched him live. Breath came back into bodies that had forgotten how to do it. He set the cup down and turned his head fractionally. Not to Hale. Not to the priest. To Sable. Come, he said. Not loud. Not kind. Simply true. She went, cane tapping once on stone, that sound a small anchor in a room full of noise that lied. She stopped where a servant stops, 2 arm lengths from the dais, eyes lowered though no one could see them. He stood. The chair's legs made a small sound like a decision. Wolves lifted their heads again and didn't bother to pretend it was about anything else. Jarek descended the steps. Not fast. Not slow. One pace, then another, until the space between them had to say what it meant. He didn't reach for her. He didn't touch the cloth. He looked at the place where the knot sat tied neat against her nape, then raised his eyes back to her face. The hall leaned in. Hale's attention sharpened like a blade freshly honed. The priest held his breath so carefully it made more noise than a gasp. Jarek's voice barely moved the air. Enough, he repeated, but this time it wasn't for the hall. It was for the performance the priest had been about to begin again, for the lie everyone preferred, for the comfort that would keep them from asking the right question. He let that settle. Then he gave the question shape. Remove the cloth. It wasn't a command barked to fill a room. It wasn't a request dressed as mercy. It was a line drawn where truth waits. Between them. In front of everyone. Sable's fingers didn't know whether to tremble or be still. She chose still. Slowly, she lifted one hand from the cane, let it find the knot that had been her answer to every risk for years, and felt the linen's small, stubborn weight. Under the stones, the hum rose, curious now, as if the keep itself paused to listen. Wolves didn't move. Nobles forgot their goblets. Hale's smile froze, polished and useless. Jarek did not look away. Sable set 2 fingertips to the knot. And pulled. If this hooked you, tap like and follow so you don't miss the next chapter. Back in her narrow chamber below the kitchens, Sable set the cane against the wall and lowered herself before the cracked shard of mirror. The glass warped her outline, but she wasn't searching for her reflection, she was watching for the glow beneath her skin, the one only she could feel. With steady fingers, she dipped into the ash mixture and drew veil ink over her wrists. The strokes were sharp, practiced, almost ritual. The ink stung faintly, smelled metallic, alive. Every day she bound herself tighter to the disguise, cover the shimmer in her blood, smother the hum in her bones, remind herself she was nothing more than a blind servant. Her hands shook tonight. Jarek's voice still lived in her chest. Remove the cloth. No one had ever dared speak it like that before. She wasn't alone. Two small faces blinked at her from the corner shadows, the children she had hidden when no one else would. Underweed born, thin as reeds, their silver-flecked eyes shone in the dim light. Orphans of the last sweep. The boy whispered, voice trembling with awe, "You caught it. The arrow. You heard it?" His sister clutched his arm tighter, wide-eyed and afraid of the truth. Sable pressed a finger to her lips. Silence. They obeyed, but the boy couldn't stop staring at her like she was something more than the disguise she wore. She turned back to the mirror, tracing one last line of ink until the burning dulled. It would hold. For now. When the castle grew quiet, she moved. The cane tapped softly as she slipped through servant corridors and half-forgotten stairwells. The path to the bond vault wasn't meant for her kind, but she knew it anyway, knew the draft of air through a crack in stone, the old drain that still smelled of rest and vows. She pressed through until the vault's heavy iron door loomed before her. Her skin prickled. The vault thrummed like a living chest, full of hearts beating out of rhythm. Inside, rows of shelves groaned under scrolls, seals, parchments that recorded every oath and bond in the kingdom, mate vows, fealty pacts, blood promises. But when her fingertips brushed the nearest one, she knew something was wrong. The hum skipped. Names bled through places they did not belong. Threads had been severed and tied to others, cords twisted where they had once run clean. It wasn't just lies. Someone had been cutting lives apart and stitching them back together in the records. Her chest ached as the truth unfurled. Chancellor Hale. His hand was in this. She had heard him brag of updating bonds, but this was no update. It was theft. Wolves who had sworn loyalty now bound to strangers. Debts erased. Alliances forged with stolen blood. Even mate marks, sacred as breath, rewritten. The ink on her wrists heated, fighting her rising hum. But she saw it anyway, the lattice above the castle glowing, trembling like a spider's web stretched to breaking. And there, taut and bright, one chord sang louder than the rest. Jarex. It ran pure, untouched, yet pulled at her as if it knew her name. She reached for it. Every bone in her body wanted to touch. But the veil burned, and she dropped her hand before she could betray herself completely. Boots scuffed stone behind her. Torches flared. She spun just as guards flooded the doorway. She staggered back, letting her shoulders hunch, tilting her head like the helpless blind girl they thought she was. One guard muttered, "Just a servant." "She's lost." But then came another voice, calm, cutting, far too close. "Not lost. Looking." Hale stepped into the torchlight, his robes brushing the ground, smile neat as a knife. His eyes slid across the shelves, then to the black stains still wet on her wrists. "I wondered who kept tugging at loose threads," he said softly. "Should have guessed the little blind girl." Sable bowed her head, fingers locked hard around her cane. The hum inside her begged to spill, but she forced it down. Hale drew closer, lowering his voice until it reached only her. "The king thinks you're harmless. The nobles pity you. But me?" His smile sharpened. "I smell a lie." He snapped his fingers. Rough hands seized her arms. Guards yanked her forward, her cane clattering against the stone floor. "Take her," Hale ordered. "The council will want to see what our miracle girl truly is." The cords above the vault groaned like beasts straining at chains. The ink on her wrists flared, burning like fire under her skin. And for the first time in years, Sable felt her breath catch not with silence, but with the desperate, dangerous urge to speak. And she knew, if even one word escaped, everything she had hidden would shatter. They dragged her through the under corridors, torchlight smearing walls with restless flame. Every jolt of the guard's grip bruised her arms, but Sable kept her head bowed, her body limp like a ragged doll. She let them believe the blind girl had no teeth. Inside, the hum was a storm, thrashing against her ribs, clawing to be heard. Stone stairs opened into the high chamber of council, a circle of thrones carved from wolf bone and iron. The air there always tasted of smoke and old blood. 12 counselors sat in their ring, cloaks heavy with silver clasps, their wolves stirring behind their eyes. Hale took his place at the king's right hand, smile faint, satisfied. At the center, Yarrick sat like carved thunder. He was the only one who did not look eager. His dark gaze tracked her as the guards shoved her to her knees. Sable felt it burn through her cloth, steady as an arrow that never missed. "This is her," Hale announced, voice sliding through the chamber. "The servant who caught an assassin's arrow without sight. The girl who sniffed poison where no one else did. Miracles, your majesty. But miracles always have a price." Murmurs rippled. Some eyes narrowed in suspicion. Others lit with hunger, the kind that wanted to tear and taste. Jarrek's voice cut through. "You call her forward as an accused?" "Not accused," Hale corrected smoothly. "Examined. For the safety of crown and court. Surely you would not deny us proof of her purity." The priest entered then, clutching a new vial of salt oil, thicker, darker. The scent made Sable's wrists burn. The ink prickled, alive with warning. Hale gestured lazily. "A simple blessing, Majesty. If she is what she claims, a harmless blind girl, it will pass without harm. If not, better we know now than later." The guards yanked her arms out. She could feel the oil before it touched, heat buzzing against her skin. Her hum swelled, desperate to push it away. She bit the inside of her cheek, hard enough to taste copper, holding the storm inside. And then Yarrick spoke. "Enough." The word filled every corner, quiet but absolute. The priest froze mid-step. The guards stiffened. Even the council wolves tucked their ears. Hale's smile faltered. "Majesty. I said enough." Yarrick stood, the weight of his presence cracking the room in two. His eyes locked on Sable. "Remove the cloth." The world went still. The priest's hand trembled, oil dripping onto the stone. Counselors leaned forward like wolves scenting blood. Hale's breath caught sharp, then steadied, his smile returning, too pleased. Sable's fingers twitched. The knot burned at her nape. She had worn this mask for so many years it had become her skin. To untie it now was to tear herself open. To risk the ink failing, the hum rising, the truth spilling like silver light across the floor. Yarrick didn't move closer. He didn't soften. His voice came low, steady. "I will not have you tested like an animal. You'll show them on your own terms. Remove it." Her pulse thundered. She heard the council breathing, a dozen predators leaning into the scent of revelation. She heard Hale's heart beat faster, smug and waiting for the mask to fall. Her hand rose, slow as prayer. Fingers brushed the knot. Linen rasped. The whole chamber leaned forward. Sable's breath caught. She tugged. And the cloth began to slip. Sable felt the knot give like a held breath. Linen loosened under her fingers and slid. Cool air kissed damp skin. The room leaned closer, a single animal with 100 hungry eyes. She could hear the want in it, the scrape of someone's ring against their chair, the little gasp a courtier tried to swallow, Hale's pulse ticking up behind his pleasant face. She drew the cloth to the edge of her cheekbone. Light pressed through the weave, thin gold against lashes. The hum in the stones climbed, the lattice tasting change. Her wrists burned where the ink lay, warning hard and bright. If she pulled 1 inch more, the thing inside her voice would step forward and the room would never be the same. Yarrick didn't move. He just stood there, weight steady, hands open at his sides, not a threat, not a plea, an anchor. "On your terms," he said, softer than the scrape of silk. "Not theirs. Not his." He didn't look at Hale when he said it, but the word has landed anyway. Hale's smile thinned. "We are all eager to see truth, Majesty. Truth hides only when it means harm." Sable lifted the cloth another finger width. Air stung. Her fingers shook. The ink climbed her throat like ivy, ready to choke or save. She found her breath, shallow and mean, and told her body to be stone. Then the bells on the east wall slammed the room in half. Not the little silver chimes the priest liked, these were iron-throated and angry. Fire bells. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 again. Smoke reached the chamber seconds later, dry and bitter, crawling under the door like a thing that had learned to hunt. A runner barreled in, sweat bright on his face, words tripping. Undercity, tunnels, fire, press gangs, people resisting. The court broke into noise. Chairs scraped. Wolves bristled. The priest fumbled his vial and almost dropped it. Hale's head turned just a shade, annoyance flickering before he caught it and smoothed it flat. Yarrick didn't look away from Sable until he knew she was breathing. Only then did he turn. Grell. With me. Sound the outer call. No purges. Evacuate and open the cisterns. Anyone forcing pledges answers to me. Hale recovered his smile fast. Majesty, this is precisely why we need a cleansing. The underweave grows bold. Let the guard press the vowswe. No, Yarrick said, the worded door closing. He nodded at the wolves. Hold the chamber. Then, to Sable, voice pitched for her and no one else, stay close. Her fingers dropped from the knot. The cloth lay against her cheek, loosened, not fallen. She tied it again with quick, clumsy hands. Cowardice, a voice in her said. No, timing. She took her cane, found the floor, and followed the king out of a room that suddenly wanted to watch someone else burn. The corridors shrank to heat and echo, boots and breath and the smell of old smoke stirred by new. The Undercity's mouth yawned under the keep like a wound. Heat licked their faces. Screams carried, thin and sharp, the kind that come when hope gets trampled and still doesn't lie down. Down there, fire ran like gossip, fast, wrong, hungry. Tents went up first, canvas coughing sparks. Crates popped like ribs. A beam dropped and the tunnel breathed in with a roar. Children scurried in the dark, palm prints streaked black on stone. Sable's heart hammered all the names she knew and all the names she didn't. Guards in Hale's colors moved in pairs, torches high, parchments out, salt oil gleaming on their palms. A woman knelt with her wrists forced together, a ribbon writhing above the page as if the air itself were starving for her yes. Sable didn't remember deciding. She was just there, cane striking the parchment edge with a crack that turned the ribbon's hunger into confusion. It recoiled and snapped, lashing a guard's cheek with blue light. He hissed, stumbled, dropped his torch. Flame spilled. Smoke rose like a false god. Back. Jarrek's voice cut through heat. He was suddenly at her shoulder, cloak thrown to smother the dropped torch, one hand bare to turn a falling beam. The weight drove him to a knee. He took it and rose with it anyway, a growl tearing his throat to make it move. He wasn't just strong. The room listened to him the way you listen to the thing that decides if you get to see tomorrow. A child's cry knifed the smoke. Sable ran into it, cloth wet with sweat, lungs burning. She found small fingers against a wall and followed them to 2 bodies huddled in a pocket of air that wouldn't last. Up, she rasped, voice raw and wrong in her mouth. Hands. Hold the cane. They grabbed. She led. The floor under her feet told her where it was safe. The heat told her what would fail. She walked that line and pulled them through it. Yarrick was there again, gathering them against him and pushing them toward clean air. The little boy stared at Sable like she had just stepped out of a story. You came, he said, soot streaking his lip. Always, she lied, because this time she had, and lies sometimes had to be true second. The hum under the stone rose, ugly now, fear pounding through it. The guards had started binding without waiting for orders. The lattice felt that as pain and answered with noise. If this fed itself, the root would shiver. Tunnels would pick a direction and it wouldn't be up. Sable's wrists went hot. She heard the first thread snap, someone's bond cut by panic or coercion, and it echoed like a scream through the web. She set her cane, planted her feet, and let her hum out just enough to bend the sound. It wasn't music. It was leverage. The cords stopped clawing for throats and listened, shocked that anyone spoke their language without trying to own them. She could only hold it a breath at a time. It was like trying to soothe a herd with a whisper while the barn burned. Yarrick watched her, his eyes burning through smoke. If he had any doubts left about what she was, the tunnel burned them off. He stepped in, his wolf coming up under his skin, a low rumble leaving his chest that sat under her note like bedrock. The cord steadied another inch. A guard who was about to force oil onto a terrified man froze, suddenly confused by his own hands. For a sliver of time, the three of them, girl, king, lattice, held the same breath. Then Hale's voice arrived, clean and cool as a knife dipped in water. "What a marvel," he said, stepping through heat without a smear on his robe. Soldiers flowed around him like a river that had been told to smile. "Look how the cords bow for her. Look how the king's voice follows. The underweave burns, and she sings it quiet." His smile widened, bright with pity that was really aim. "There's your witch." Sable turned. He wasn't wrong about the bowing. The cords did answer her. But which was the wrong word? It wasn't spells. It was language. And if she tried to say that out loud in this tunnel with this smoke and those men, she would make it worse. Yarrick stepped between them before she could speak. "Stand your men down," he said. "Stamps and oil away. Anyone binding in smoke answers to me." Hale's hands lifted in a little shrug. "Why so defensive, sire? If she is harmless, let us bless. If she is not, let us save you." He glanced at the two children clutching Sable's tunic. "Tell me, little ones, did she come alone, or did the king send her? Who sings to you at night when the cords get loud?" The boy shrank. The girl bared her teeth, a tiny wolf with no business snarling at a blade. Sable put herself in front of them without thinking, cane a dark line against her leg. Hale's smile dropped the last of its warmth. "Seize her." Steel lifted. Boots dug. The tunnel narrowed to nothing. Yarrick didn't raise his sword. He didn't have to. He moved once, exactly into the space where the first two soldiers had to pass, and let the weight of what he was fill the air. "Anyone touches her answers to me," he said, and the wolf under his voice came up until even the fire paused to listen. Hale didn't step back. He tilted his head like a man admiring a trap he'd set hours ago. "Then answer this, Majesty. When she sings, do you move because you want to, or because you can't help yourself?" Sable's throat ached. The hum barely held. Smoke clawed. Somewhere behind them, a being groaned with a sound that meant the next choice would be ugly no matter what they picked. The soldiers shifted their weight. The tunnel braced. And the cords, hungry for a yes or a no, pulled tighter, waiting to see which kind of breaking would come first. Smoke made the tunnel breathe like a sick animal. Soldiers shifted to seize her, metal rasping against leather, the kind of sound you remember in your bones. Sable tasted iron and ash and fear that wasn't hers. Yarrick moved first. Not with steel, he didn't need it. He stepped into the narrow where two men had to pass shoulder to shoulder and let the weight of his wolf fill the space. "Stand down," he said. Not loud. Final. Two soldiers froze mid-step, instincts outrunning orders. The third didn't. He lunged for Sable's arm. Her cane snapped up, not to strike his face but the parchment in his other hand. Would met wax seal with a crack. Blue light spat, startled, as the ribbon above the writ flailed for a throat and found none. The guards jerked back like men who'd nearly swallowed a snake. "Enough," Yarrick said again, eyes on Hale. "Get them out." He flicked two fingers, and the wolves behind him flowed forward, not to maul, but to herd the panicked into air. The press eased. Sable kept her hum low, just enough to teach the cords to listen instead of bite. The fire hissed, angry at losing an audience. Hale watched it all with a small, tight smile. "You make mercy look useful," he murmured, almost admiring. "It won't hold." Yarrick didn't answer him. He lifted the fallen boy to his hip like he'd done that 1,000 times, handed the sister to a waiting guard he trusted, and nodded toward the stair. Go. When the last coughed into breath and the last ember died under wet burlap, the tunnel sagged into a dirty quiet. Sable leaned against the cool wall, cloth damp, lungs raw. The hum under the stone settled the smallest fraction, like a beast deciding not to bite today. Yarrick turned back to her. Smoke smudged his jaw, and a black streak cut across his cheekbone. His eyes were steady and too clear. Come with me. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a question. It was the only path that wouldn't pull the wrong cord. She nodded once, found her cane, and followed him up out of heat. He took her not to the council chamber that smelled of old victory and new knives, but to a narrow room off the map hall. The door clicked shut behind them, dull and private. Shelves lined one wall, stuffed with rolled charts and little wooden wolves pinned to borders. A lamp burned low. Grell stood by it, soot on her sleeves, ledger under her arm, proof that even in smoke someone had kept track of who lived. They're safe, Grell said before Sable could ask. The children and the old. We'll resettle them on the high streets for a week. No names in any registry. She looked between them, read the air, and set the ledger down. I'll post 2 wolves. No more. She slipped out like a woman who knew when to leave a room to the people it wanted. Silence held. Sable could feel the lattice through the stone here too, but it wasn't hungry. It waited, the way a listening friend does when you are trying to peel a truth loose. Yarrick took off his cloak, laid it over the back of a chair like the heat still needed tending, and turned his hands palm up. Not close. Not reaching. What are you? Her throat tried to shut. Habit is a clever jailer. She made it move anyway. I hear threads. The words landed with less drama than the fear around them. Not magic. Not a spell. The chords, they hum. I can bend their noise when it turns ugly. His mouth twitched like he knew that already and had been waiting to hear her say it. And the cloth? Armor. She let her fingers touch the knot and drop. Pity is safer than power. For a while. You caught an arrow blind, he said, not accusing. You smelled poison and spilled it before I drank. A beat. You walked into fire. So did you, she said, and that came out sharper than she meant. She swallowed. I didn't walk in for heroics. They were binding in smoke. The courts hate that. They start to snap. Like people, he said quietly. She looked at his hands, big and clean now that the worst was over, smoke ground into the lines. You asked me to remove the cloth. I did, he said. And then the bells rang. He paused, listening to something she couldn't. I won't ask again in front of people who want a spectacle. It's yours. If you take it off, it will be on your terms. The room breathed with them. She felt her ribs loosen an inch. If I tell you I won't, she rasped, do you send me back to the kitchens? I send you where you want to stand, he said. No weight on it. No trap. Preferably near me. Because I don't want to do the next 10 nights without the only person in this keep who can make the lattice stop sharpening its teeth. Her laugh was ugly and honest. Your chancellor will have me burned. Then I'll be warm, he said, like a man stating inventory. His eyes didn't move from her covered ones. Let me mark you. Her heart stumbled. Mark? Not with ribbon, he said. Ink. He turned his wrist over, scar at his pulse catching the low light. Not ownership. A witness. If you want me. Want. The word found places her training had told her to lock. She drew the little kit from her belt with hands that shook and didn't. The smell rose, iron and rain. She warmed a drop, the way you do when you mean it to live. He held still while she touched the ink to his pulse. 2 strokes, and a small open circle where a leash would have closed. Say it, she whispered, and didn't know until she said it that she needed to hear it. Yes, he answered, with the kind of certainty that makes rooms find their edges. The lattice under the floor noted it without gossip. Her lungs eased. She turned her wrist toward him. Only if you want me, she said, because the words mattered more than the mark. His fingers were warm. He drew what she'd drawn, not a mirror, a reply. 2 strokes. An open circle. His breath touched her skin, and the hum that lived behind her voice relaxed like a skittish animal finally deciding a hand was a hand. She didn't take off the cloth. He didn't ask. The marks dried, a new boundary that wasn't a wall. Now what? She asked, because smoke still lived in her mouth and a chancellor still lived in the keep. Now we go to the root, he said. If Hale's rewriting vows, he'll try to cut the trunk thread next. If he severs it, everything snaps or strangles, she finished. I know. She tucked the kid away. We'll need Grell. And 2 wolves who can keep their teeth in. He nodded once. Done. The door blew in before his next breath. Wood hit stone with a bang that echoed off the rolled maps. Wolves snarled, then checked themselves. Hale had brought half the guard with him and the priest in white at his shoulder. The chancellor stepped into the room like a man walking onto a stage he'd rented by the year. Forgive the informality, Hale said, not sorry at all. He lifted a black tube banded in blue. Emergency procedure, Majesty. For the safety of the realm. He uncapped it. The ribbon inside woke like a snake catching warmth. Jarek's face didn't move. You brought a royal writ into my private room. Not just any, Hale said softly. The assurance. Old law for older dangers. When influence compromises judgment, the crown renews its oath with the realm so it can't be bent. Harmless, if there's nothing to hide. He tipped the tube. Blue slid out, bright and eager. Priest? The priest's hands shook, but his training did not. He lifted the silver ampulla. Oil caught the lamplight and grinned. The ribbon scented Sable's skin and turned, drawn, delighted. The ink at her wrist burned like a struck match. Yarrick stepped between. No. Hale's smile held. Sire, your refusal reads like confession. He lifted the tube higher. The ribbon rose, tasting the scar on Jarek's wrist and the wet ink around it. If you are clean, let the writ kiss you. If she is harmless, let it kiss her too. Guards edged the walls, making the room smaller than it was. The wolf's lips lifted just enough to be understood. Sable felt the lattice start to climb, ready to grab whatever the ribbon claimed and drag it into the trunk. Stand down, Yarrick said, low. It didn't change the number of men in the room. It changed how they breathed. Hale took one small step, the ribbon luring toward skin. Majesty, please. Don't make a scene. The law is the law. Sable's hum rose by itself, raw and thin, the only blade she owned. The ribbon stuttered, confused by someone speaking to it in its own tongue. The priest's hands trembled harder. Hale's eyes flashed triumph, cool and quick. There it is, he said softly. The pull. He flicked his wrist. The blue light lunged. The ribbon lunged like lightning freed from a cage. Blue fire arced through the chamber, hungry, wrapping the air between Jarek's scarred wrist and Sable's covered face. The lattice under the stone shivered with recognition, eager to grab whatever the ribbon claimed and weave it into the root. Sable didn't think. Her hum rose sharp and cutting, a sound she'd never made in front of more than a child or two in the tunnels. It wasn't a song, it was a command. The ribbon halted mid-strike, thrashing like a leashed animal. The priest gasped, hands trembling, oil sloshing against silver. Guards staggered as if the floor tilted. Yarrick moved into the blaze. He caught the ribbon with his bare hand. It seared him, blue light crackling up his arm. His jaw locked against the pain, but he didn't release. Enough, he said, the wolf in him pulling weight behind the word. The lattice stilled, shocked at 2 voices calling it in the same breath. Hale's smile cracked. Majesty, you endanger yourself. Let it bind, let it prove. Yarrick yanked. The ribbon shrieked like steel bent past reason and collapsed into ash. The tube clattered to the floor, useless. Proof enough, he said, voice raw. The guards shifted, confused between orders and instinct. The wolves bristled, one step from lunging. The priest backed toward the wall, white robe streaked with oil and soot, muttering prayers that sounded more like apologies. Hale's mask returned, smooth and poisonous. You reveal too much, sire. You protect her against the law, against the faith, against sense itself. When the council learns you destroyed a royal writ, then they'll learn, Yarrick cut in. His gaze never left Hale's. And if they choose war over truth, they'll choke on both. Sable stood frozen, cloth damp against her cheek, wrists burning from the ink. She should have been terrified. Instead, something inside her unlocked. Yarrick's mark on her wrist thrummed against her pulse. He had burned for her without flinching. He had caught the ribbon in his own hand when the whole keep wanted to see her bound. She whispered without meaning to, why? Yarrick turned then, and for the first time since she'd known him, his eyes were not a king's, not a wolf's, just a man's, tired, resolute, sure. Because you're mine to protect. Not to own. To choose. And if the courts don't like it, they can learn. Hale's composure slipped. Fury flashed through the cracks. He gathered his robes like armor, voice cutting cold. Very well. The council will have its answer. You've set yourself against the law, Majesty. You'll answer for it when they convene. He swept from the room with the priest trailing, guards torn between following and fear. The door slammed, leaving the chamber ringing with smoke and silence. Yarrick dropped the ashes of the ribbon to the table, breath harsh. His palm was raw and blistered, but he didn't look at it. His eyes stayed on Sable. Her hands trembled. She tightened the knot of her cloth even as every part of her wanted to tear it off. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. I'd do it again, he said. Then softer, but I won't decide for you. The lattice pulsed once under the stone, uneasy, as if listening to promises it had no word for. Sable stepped closer, so near she could feel the heat radiating from his burnt hand. Her cane tilted against the wall. For one breath, one heartbeat, she imagined dropping the cloth right there and letting him see. Letting him see everything. But footsteps thundered in the hall, wolves this time, Grell's voice sharp and urgent. Majesty, Hale's moving on the root. The cords underfoot trembled. The root thread, trunk of the whole lattice, shivered like something about to snap. Yarrick looked at her once, steady and sure. With me, he said. And for the first time, she didn't hesitate. The root tower loomed like a spine of black stone above the palace, every rib of it braided with cords thick enough to feel in the teeth. By the time Yarrick and Sable reached the base stair, the hum was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, threads jerking against each other as though Hale had set the lattice to strangle itself. Grell met them there, stood still in her hair, sword strapped backward across her back so her hands were free for the ledger. He's already inside. Took half the guard, said it was. Emergency doctrine. If he cuts the trunk, the whole weave will collapse. The city will tear itself apart. Yarrick glanced at Sable. How close can you get? Her hand went to the knot of her cloth, fingers trembling but steady. Close enough if I don't stop to lie. She pulled her cane tight to her side. The ink at her wrist seared, hungry to answer the root directly. They ascended into air that crackled with power. Each step vibrated underfoot, cords shrieking like harps overstrung. At the chamber's heart stood the root itself, a single column of braided light and stone, thicker than any man's reach. Hale was already there, robe flaring as he lifted a ceremonial knife, its blade drenched in salt oil. The priest cowered at his shoulder, too afraid to move, too afraid to leave. You're too late, Hale said, voice rich with triumph. The lattice has served us too long. It bends to any voice, any hum, any trick. Better to sever it and bind the kingdom with law alone. Wolves should rule with teeth, not whispers in the stone. He raised the knife. No, Sable whispered, but the cords heard. Her hum poured out, not sharp this time but low, coaxing. The root flinched, threads twitching toward her like thirsty vines. The cloth over her eyes burned. The ink at her wrist bled heat into her palm. Yarrick stepped between Hale and the root, sword drawn now, a line of steel against madness. Drop it. Hale laughed, wild. Still protecting her? Even now, when she's the proof of corruption? She bends the cords to her will. You think that won't end with you on your knees, Majesty? Sable's voice cracked the air. They don't want to be bent. They want to be heard. She took 3 steps forward, the hum vibrating through her bones until her knees shook. The cloth slipped from her brow, falling useless to the floor. Silver light bled from her eyes, spilling across the chamber. The root shuddered, threads turning like faces toward her. Hale's triumph soured into horror. Abomination, he spat, and slashed down. Yarrick moved faster. Steel met steel with a scream that split the tower. The knife clattered, spinning across stone. Hale lunged again, teeth bared, but Yarrick's wolf rose behind his eyes and one backhand sent the Chancellor sprawling. The root flailed, cords snapping wild, some striking stone hard enough to scar it. The hum grew near unbearable. Sable pressed her hands to the trunk. Her voice trembled, broken but true. You are not alone. You never were. The cords froze, then softened, weaving together not in strangulation but in embrace. Silver light spread down the trunk, across the lattice, out through the stones of the city. The roar became a thrum like a great heartbeat. For the first time in generations, the weave hummed calm. Yarrick's burned hand closed over hers on the root. His mark against her wrist pulsed, ink answering ink. With you, he said, steady as earth. The chamber stilled. The priest dropped to his knees. Hale lay gasping, fury leaking into fear. And above them all, the root glowed with a new balance, no longer ruled by silence or law, but by choice shared. Sable turned, breath raw, cloth forgotten on the floor. The king was looking at her without crown, without command. Just looking. And for the first time, she let him. The cliffhanger lay in the silence that followed, heavy with decision. What price would the council demand now that the courts had chosen her? The root tower rose like a spine of black stone above the keep, every rib of it braided with cords you could feel in your teeth. By the time they reached the base stair, the hum wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar trying to swallow its own echo, threads jerking against threads as if someone had told the lattice to strangle itself and it had believed. Grell waited there with soot in her hair and a ledger hugged close, sword strapped backward across her back so her hands stayed free to work. Her breath came quick, but her voice didn't shake. He's inside. Took half the guard. He said it's emergency doctrine. If he cuts the trunk, the whole weave will whip back on itself. We'll lose the city by sundown. Yarrick looked at Sable the way you look before a jump, checking if the ground beneath your feet is courage or habit. How close can you get? Her fingers found the knot at her nape. The cloth felt heavier than it had that morning, as if it had been drinking the room's fear and wanted to keep all of it. Close enough if I don't stop to lie. She pulled her cane tight to her side. The marks on both their wrists had dried, small and black, open circles that were heavier than any seal. The ink there warmed, as if the root knew its own name and had just heard it spoken. They climbed into air wired with power, every step a struck string. Stone trembled underfoot. Old chalk sigils on the walls had started to flake as if the tower itself were molting. The closer they got, the more the cords insisted. They didn't just hum now. They begged. They accused. They threw up old vows like smoke, made out of names and dates and days when someone had said yes and meant it, and days when someone had said yes because the knife had been closer than breath. Sable's breath went thin. The lattice's call pressed against her ears and her throat and the tender place behind her sternum where you keep the truth you can't say. She could hear individual threads if she leaned into the sound. This one a fealty pledged 30 years ago by a man with oil under his nails and worry over his wheat. This one a child's first promise to never run again if someone would just leave the door unlocked. This one a mate bond that had been rewritten in a vault and never healed right, all scar and ache. Grell peeled off at the second landing to cut the stairs at the far side and bring 2 wolves she trusted. Yarrick didn't speed up. He kept his pace human and sure, as if rushing would be a way to admit fear into the room. Sable matched him, Kane telling her where the stone had learned to flex and where it hadn't. The cloth scratched at her lashes with each step. Her wrists burned as if they knew before her mouth did what she would have to do. The chamber hit them like weather. A cavern of rope and light and stone, the root blooming up from the floor like a living column of braided cords wider than 3 men's reach, every strand climbing, weaving, unweaving, trying to remember what it had been taught and what it wanted. Guards ringed the space in a ragged circle, faces pale and set. Some wore Hale's pins. Some wore none. The priest stood near the trunk, hands shoved under his sleeves to hide their shaking. And Hale looked like triumph with a blade. The ceremonial knife in his hand drank light and gave back a thin, hungry gleam. Salt oil slicked its edge. The smell of it cut the air like acid. "You're too late," he called, voice rich with victory he hadn't earned yet. "The lattice has served too long. It answers to whispers, to tricks, to any mutter that feeds it. Law should not have to ask. Law should bite. Wolves should rule with teeth, not music in stone." His eyes flicked to Sable, to the cloth over her eyes, to the cane, to the marks at her wrist. He smiled like a man who had finally tracked a sound he'd heard in the dark for months. "There. The rot. A servant who hums at chords and a king who bleeds to catch a ribbon for her. Abomination and enthrallment. I will be praised for ending this." He lifted the knife in a slow, practiced arc, the kind of movement you teach your arm when you want people to think you were born to it. "No," Sable said, and the root heard even if the men didn't. Her hum moved without permission, not sharp this time but low and coaxing, a hand offered to a skittish animal. The cords nearest her flinched and then leaned, threads turning like thirsty vines toward water. The cloth burned against her skin. The ink at her wrist bled heat into her palm. She took one step, another, until the sound made her knees shake. Yarrick stepped between Hale and the root with steel in his hand, sword drawn not to kill but to tell the room the line where sense lived. "Drop it." Hale laughed like laughter was a knife too. "Still protecting her? Even now? She bends the cords to her will and you call it kindness. Today it's vows. Tomorrow it's your spine." He lifted the knife higher, eyes gleaming, and slashed down. Yarrick was faster. Steel met steel with a scream that made the tower flinch. Sparks spit and skittered. The knife pinwheeled, skittered across stone, and fetched up under the root like a rat trying to hide. Hale lunged for Jarrek's throat and got Jarrek's fist instead, a clean backhand that put him on the floor blinking at a ceiling that didn't care. The root didn't calm. It lashed, cords whipping air hard enough to leave bright scars when they struck stone. The hum went past sound, into pressure, into a weight that pushed at joints and breath and thoughts. Sable got close enough to touch. The vibration in the trunk traveled up her arms and into her ribs and found the place her voice lived. Her palms hit the braid. The world narrowed to sound and heat and 1,000 desperate yes fighting hundreds of old wrong ones. She couldn't fix any of that. She could only be a steady place. "You're not alone," she told it, voice cracking. "You never were." The chords paused the way a crowd does when someone speaks the line everyone thought but dared not say. Threads softened. The ones dragged tight by fear found a lower place to rest. The ones that had been forced into angles they didn't fit eased an inch toward true. Jarrek's burned hand closed over hers on the root. Skin to skin. Ink to scar. His mark against her wrist pulsed as if it had always been meant to answer here. "With you," he said. "Nothing heroic. Just that." The chamber held its breath. A guard swallowed too loud. The priest dropped to his knees with a sound like a man's first prayer after years of saying them wrong. Hale rolled to his side and pushed up, fury leaking into fear and back into fury so fast his face couldn't keep up. Sable heard the cords wanting to please. Wanting to obey. It wasn't because the root loved her. It was because it had been trained to listen to force and mistook care for it. She lowered her hum further, the way you lower your voice when a frightened horse tilts its ears and you don't want it to bolt. No more hunting throats, she whispered to it. No more dragging. You carry or you wait. The root answered with a shiver that ran out through the tower into the keep and the streets beyond, into houses where a woman at a window suddenly remembered she didn't have to sign a paper this morning if she didn't want to, into a barrack where a soldier paused with a stamp in his hand and put it down. Hale's voice came back sharp. Enough. He snatched at the knife under the cords and came up with a new blade entirely, thin, black, wrong. Not the sanctified thing the priest had brought. Something older, oiled in some dark, shimmering mixture that made Sable's ink hiss under her skin. He moved for Sable, not the root. If the mouth that sings is cut, the song ends, he hissed, and lunged. Yarrick stepped to meet him, but the tower itself bucked. A cord snapped and whipped across the floor, cracking at his ankle. He stumbled. Hale's knife came on. Sable turned, palm still on the root, and let the hum go sharp for the first time. Not a blade. A line. The cords nearest her swung, not to strike Hale but to catch his wrist and pull it off course. The blade kissed stone and screamed. He tore free with a howl, blood bright on his palm where the thread had burned him. He stared at the welt like it had betrayed him personally. You think they'll love you for this? He panted. You think you can keep it gentle by yourself? This city eats the weak. It always has. That trunk is a promise to bite first. Sable almost laughed. It came out like a cough. Then we teach it different. Teach, he spat. What a pretty word for control. Yarrick moved again, not at Hale but to the priest. He took the silver ampulla from shaking hands and hurled it into the far wall, where it shattered and spilled oil in a harmless arc. No more blessings with knives, he said. You're a fool, Hale whispered. He looked wider than the room now, beyond it, to a council chamber full of men whose rings had drawn blood cheaper than taxes. You think you can declare consent and have it stick because you say it pretty? They'll drag you from that chair. They'll use me to do it. Yarrick didn't look away. Maybe they will. But not today. The tower changed its mind in the next breath. The cord stopped lashing and began to pull everything, air, men, noise, toward the trunk. The root didn't want to strangle anymore. It wanted to swallow. When something fed on orders for generations and you took its orders away, it got hungry for something else. It wanted yes so badly it would take it out of a body if it could. Sable felt it the way you feel the sea decide to take you. She shoved her voice into the gap, braced it like a beam, and set a rhythm that wasn't hunger. Wait, she told it. Wait. Wait. The word had to be louder than breath and lower than panic. She reached for Yarrick without looking and found his burned hand and held. He flinched, pain, instinct, but then he folded his fingers through hers and squeezed. His grip steadied her mouth. His voice came up under hers, the wolf in him laying a long, resonant note. The root liked that sound. It had been trained to like power. She and the king borrowed that training and changed its shape. Grell burst through the door with two wolves at her back, both of them holding themselves like men with orders to fight and hearts that wanted to listen instead. She took in the scene with one savage glance and didn't approach. She planted her boots, lifted her chin at the guards, and said in the tone she used to inventory grain, anyone leaves his post to touch that girl will spend next winter counting mice in the North Tower. It was ridiculous. It worked. Men who had been leaning toward movement leaned back toward sense. The room remembered how to hold still. Hale panted like a runner and found a laugh in it. Look at you, he sneered, but there was something like awe in it now. No bells. No stamps. Just a girl and a broken man. Do you know what you look like? A myth. Do you know what myths make? Martyrs. He lifted his arms and threw his voice to the guards. Witness. He burns writs. He lifts a witch to the root. Yarrick didn't shut him up with a blow. He let him talk and kept his eyes on Sable. I have you, he said into the thunder, and he said it like a fact, not a promise. The ink at both their wrists answered with heat. He lowered his mouth toward her temple, not touching, letting his breath steady her. Teach it. She did. Not with one long speech, not with a miracle melody, but with the smallest lessons said over and over until a body learns it can stop bracing. This vow may rest. This one may dissolve. This bond may breathe. This child is not a cord to wrap around a man's hand. This soldier does not have to hammer a stamp into soft names to believe he matters. Wait. 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 The root calmed from roar to thrum. The chords softened into lines that knew how to carry weight without cutting flesh. The pressure in the air eased. Guards' shoulders dropped without their permission. A piece of plaster somewhere far down the tower fell in a small, tired sigh. Hale sagged against the wall and stared like he could not, even now, accept a world that had not been forced into shape. You'll regret this, he said, but the blade in it had dulled. All this softness. It'll break. Maybe, Sable said, too tired now to coat honesty with sugar. But if it does, it won't be my hand on anyone's throat. The priest lifted his face from his sleeves. Tears had tracked clean lines through dust on his cheeks. He looked at Sable the way a man looks at a door he had nailed shut with his own hands and now wants to open without anyone seeing him do it. What do we do? He whispered. Yarrick answered before she could. We write it down. Then we do it where everyone can see. Hale found a last piece of poison and rolled it on his tongue. You'll call a public pledge? You'll put this, girl, beside you and tell wolves she's not your leash but your choice? He laughed again, thin, frayed. Then let me be the one to summon them. I want to watch you try to keep your promises when men who made their lives out of chains smell blood. Grell's ledger snapped shut like a verdict. I'll summon them, she said. She jerked her chin at Hale. You'll come in cuffs. He bared his teeth at her like a human pretending to be a wolf. It was a sad thing to watch. He opened his mouth to argue and closed it again when the two wolves behind her smiled without humor. Sable finally let go of the root. Her hands came away hot, damp, shaking. The marks on her wrist and Jarrex were clean and dark and ordinary-looking, which somehow made them larger. She bent to pick up the cloth where it lay on the floor, a creased, tired thing. It had worked until it didn't. She folded it and tucked it into her belt like a tool she might someday use for some other job that had nothing to do with hiding. Yarrick sheathed his sword. It made a small, practical sound, the kind you only hear when the worst has been postponed rather than ended. He took in the guards still around the room and the priest still kneeling and Grell still standing with courage tucked into her thin shoulders, and he made his voice into a steady bench for them to sit on. At moonrise, he said, to all of them and the stone and the air. The hall. Not just nobles. Anyone who wants to watch the law learn its new shape. No blessings with oil. No forced hands. We read the charter. We ring the bell by two hands. And I will stand with her and say yes where everyone can hear. Hale's eyes went bright and sick. There it is, he whispered, delighted in a way that tasted of ash. The confession I needed. Enthralled in the root chamber, enthralled at the throne. Thank you, Majesty. He nodded at the priest as if granting a favor. Write it beautifully. Grell lifted two fingers, and the wolves moved on him with a neatness that said they had been waiting for someone to finally speak sense. Cuffs slid over Hale's wrists, dull iron that was less about stopping magic and more about making a point. He lifted his chin like he could pretend dignity around iron. It didn't work. Sable swayed on her feet and realized too late that her legs had decided they were done. Yerrick was already there, not catching, just offering his arm so the leaning could be a choice. She took it. She disliked that she needed to. She allowed it anyway. "Breathe," he said, like a man reminding a stubborn animal it had lungs. She did. It hurt, but it worked. They walked out of the root chamber together. The tower didn't moan anymore. It hummed the way a kitchen does after the rush, pots clean, heat gone to embers, work still to do but no panic in it. On the stairs, a few guards stepped out of the way with faces that couldn't decide how to arrange themselves. A boy who had once tried to press a ribbon to a terrified man's throat stood very straight and did not meet Sable's covered eyes. She didn't make him. He would have to find his face later. Outside, the keep held a different kind of quiet. Not peace. Readiness. You could hear it in the way the courtyard scraped brooms instead of sharpening pikes, in the way someone somewhere laughed and then clapped a hand over their mouth like laughter could break the world and then remembered it couldn't. Smoke from the tunnel still smeared the morning. The sky wore it like a bruise beginning to yellow. Bells hadn't rung yet. They waited, the way bells do when they know their next note will name something. Grell peeled off to run messages. The wolves melted to their posts. The priest went to wash his face with the air of a man who needed to look at the water for a while. Hale went to a cell that had probably never hosted a chancellor before, making history with his resentment. Sable and Yerrick crossed the courtyard together like it was a river they had to ford without getting separated. At the door to the map room, he stopped. "Dawn," he said automatically and then caught himself and shook his head. "No. Not dawn. Moonrise." His mouth tugged, tired. Old habits. She knew which ones he meant. Crown first. Man last. He had turned that around for her twice today. "Moonrise," she said, and it sounded like a vow even though it was only a time of day. He didn't reach for the cloth. He looked at it, tucked at her belt, and then at her marked wrist, and then at her face, and let his eyes do the thing the lattice had been trying to do all morning, carry without taking. "Rest," he said, which was funny, because neither of them would. He lifted his burned hand like it had stopped hurting just enough to get him to evening. "I'll send Grell with the drafts." She nodded. "Send water. And a place at the front for the underweaved children." Her voice caught on the last word. She swallowed and made it steady. "They deserve to see it done right. They'll sit on the dais," he said, and if any man in the kingdom hated that, Yerrick would enjoy watching him do it quietly. She turned to go and then turned back because the morning had already taken too many words and she didn't want to lose the one that would keep the next hour from walking crooked. "Thank you for burning your hand," she said, and it came out ridiculous and too large for his blistered palm. "And for saying no when the room wanted a show." He huffed a laugh that didn't have room to be laughter. "Thank you for teaching the root to wait." He tipped his head fractionally, a bow you could miss if you blinked. "See me at the bell." She went. The cloth at her belt tapped against her hip like a folded tongue. She didn't hate it. She didn't love it. She had made peace with what it had been. She climbed stairs that had been carved by men who trusted nothing softer than stone and found her narrow room and closed the door and let her knees remember that they were not steel. For a little while she sat with her back against wood and her wrists on her knees and listened to the keep breathe. The lattice hummed steady now. The children in the underweave, she could hear their voices in it, little bright threads of sound. Somewhere a baby wailed and then didn't. Somewhere a woman decided to keep the ring she had worn for too long but take the paper that had made it hurt and tear it in half. Somewhere a soldier put his stamp in a drawer and closed it gently. The city didn't sing. It exhaled. Moonrise would bring teeth again. Hale would call her witch on a floor full of men who liked that word because it made them feel safe about their ugliness. The priest would find his courage or hide it. Grell would hold a ledger between herself and whatever needed a reckoning. Yerrick would stand and say yes, and 1,000 eyes would try to make that word smaller than it was. Sable pulled the cloth from her belt, spread it flat on her lap, and smoothed the creases with her thumbs. It didn't look like an enemy. It looked like a piece of linen that had done hard work and was allowed to rest. She folded it once, twice, 4 times, until it fit in her palm. She held it there and felt her pulse knock under it, steady, stubborn. Then she set it on the table beside her kit and rose. By the time the bells called the realm to the hall, the cloth would still be where she'd left it. And the girl who had hidden behind it would not.